Father, we thank you so much for this opportunity to reflect on your word and your truth. All day long, people have been trying to pour information into our heads, some of it good, some of it not so good. And we always have to be in that place of filtering and filtering and filtering. But we know that the truth that sustains us, the truth that equips us and encourages us and empowers us, that word comes from you. And in your sovereignty and in your grace, through thousands of years of history, you wove a tapestry, a story of immense proportion. And through that story, we find out who you are, we find out who we are, we find out what we are meant to be and how we are to act. So this brief time that we have tonight, it's just to look into your word and try to get some perspective. Make sure that we're following the way that you intended us to follow. Because you created us, you formed us, you know what makes us tick. You know why we're here. So, Father, give us that insight as we just devote this next hour and a half or so to reflecting on your truth. So we ask this in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, well, last week we introduced the subject of sacraments. We talked a little bit about the definition of a sacrament and how over time that definition has changed through various traditions. I tried to talk about what the tradition is that I'm going to use and why we're using it that way. So it's kind of a platform to begin to move. And now what I want to do for the balance of the class is work through these two ordinances or sacraments, both words are appropriate, called baptism and the Lord's Supper. Those are the two we've settled on here in line with most of the Protestant traditions. We kind of settle on those two and define them as sacraments, or as I've called in the class, sacred signs. So for the next few weeks, we're going to look at the sacrament of baptism, and then for the last few weeks, we'll look at the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And on the baptism side, we'll start tonight by looking at some of the roots and foundations in the Old Testament. Next week, we'll pick up the teachings in the New Testament Gospels, John's baptism, what Jesus had to say about it. And then the third week, we'll look kind of some comments Paul makes and talk more about the theology of it. So right now, that's the outline. So we'll spend 3 weeks on baptism and 3 or 4 weeks on the Lord's Supper, and that'll pretty much take care of the class. So this week, then, we'll look at the Old Testament backgrounds with regard to baptism. And I think this is important. Sometimes when you listen to scholars talk about baptism, they refer to different cultures, Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, different cultures, and they say Christianity borrowed baptism from some of these other cultures. And I would push back on that idea. I think if we really study the Old Testament, we will see that the rite of baptism comes right out of the Old Testament, actually, at least in terms of its meaning and significance. I think that, to me, makes much deeper sense. And I think when we get done looking at what the Old Testament has to say about this whole idea of washing and cleansing, and we see how that unfolds throughout the story of the Old Testament, I think you'll agree with me that this gives real meaning and substance to inform what John is doing in his baptism and what Jesus is saying when he commands us to baptize. So let's see if you agree with me as we walk through this. So unfortunately, this could have been a class in itself, of Old Testament origins of baptism. But I'm going to, when I was in grad school, I actually had a 6-hour exam, and the whole question was the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. That was 6 hours just on that one subject. So we could spend hours and hours and hours just on the Old Testament idea of baptism. These things can get expanded. But so unfortunately, I don't always like to do this, but I have to pick and choose different passages to make my points, and at least to give you some idea. So if we jump right in, early on you see in this first passage I want to look at, it comes from Leviticus chapter 16, and it has to do with the high priesthood. You remember when the children of Israel were being called out of Egypt, God established Aaron, Moses as the leader, and then Aaron as the head priest, the high priest. And there is this group of people that would be the ministers before him. And when the temple gets created, or the tabernacle gets built, they are the folks who get to minister the sacraments, the sacrifices. They are the ones who actually get to handle the sacrifices. And so there are I picked two passages that refer to the necessity for these high priests to be clean before they go into the presence of God to offer these sacrifices. The one passage comes from Exodus 29. It says, "Then bring Aaron and his son to the entrance of the tent of meeting," that's the tabernacle, "and wash them with water," getting them ready to be called into ministry, if you will. And then this passage from Leviticus 16, it says, "This is how Aaron is to enter the most holy place," that Holy of Holies, that once a year where he goes in to offer on the Day of Atonement the sacrifice for the people. He says, "These are sacred garments, so he must bathe himself with water before he puts them on." He has to clothe himself and bathe himself before he goes into the Holy of Holies. And what I want us to see here is this emphasis on cleanliness to enter the presence of God. Cleanliness before you act as the mediator before God. There's this idea that don't come into holiness presence of God unless you're clean. If you remember, a couple years ago, I preached a sermon on Leviticus, and it was a summary of the book of Leviticus. And I said the central theme of the book of Leviticus is it's time to clean. All the way through that story, there's this law after law saying, be clean, be clean, be clean. And that applied especially to Aaron and the priesthood. Because if you're going to go into the holy presence of God, where God chose to reveal himself, you have to be clean. That tells us something about this holiness of God. You remember the whole way as the children of Israel made their way through the desert, there's this cloud, a pillar of cloud that goes before them, and the pillar of fire at night. And when the tabernacle is built, this cloud fills the tabernacle. And later on, when the temple gets built, it fills the temple. It's this powerful symbol of the presence of God. And the idea is if you're going to go into that holy space and go into the Holy of Holies and present a sacrifice, you better be clean. Because the notion of the holiness of God is that the presence of the holy God, it cannot tolerate any kind of filth, any kind of sin, any kind of evil, anything. It will just be destroyed in the holy presence of God. And so as you enter this place, as a reminder that people need to be clean, they cleaned on the outside. And this is fundamental to understanding the whole book of Leviticus, actually. That all those rites and all those signs, all those exhortations to the people to keep clean, to wash and bathe, and all this stuff, it was a reminder to them that they were in the presence of a holy God. And just as they were meticulous about keeping the outside clean, they were supposed to be just as meticulous in keeping the inside clean. It's a reminder that the holy presence of God lives among you. And therefore, you must be clean. And so this very important rite was there. And I give you the Hebrew word there, you folks that are kind of like to see that stuff. It's the word, and it appears over and over again. There's a couple different words, Hebrew words, that appear throughout the Old Testament that kind of inform our meaning of baptism. One of them is this word, indicating to wash or to bathe. So it's this idea of be clean. Especially these priests that have to walk into the holy presence of God. They need to be clean. And that outward cleanliness is to remind them of the necessity. Don't come before God dirty and messed up. If you're going to come into the holy presence of God, you've got to be clean. Outwardly, as a sign of the necessity to be clean inwardly. So then if we look then and take this a step further, if we look at some passages, additional passages from Leviticus, there's also various comments, not just to the priests, but to the people. By the way, if any of you didn't get these handouts, they're in the back when you come in. So that might be helpful for you if you want to follow along. There's a place to take notes. But not just the priests, but the people were to stay clean. And this is all over the place. You see this over and over again woven through the various places that the law is recorded. I recorded some of them here. And it's skin rash or disease. When you had a skin rash or disease and you wanted to be left back into the camp and you wanted to be declared clean, the priest would come and look at it, and if he decided, based upon certain criteria, that that skin rash or that disease is now over, in order to be let back to the camp, you had to wash. You had to bathe. Sexual disease or sexual contact. Sexuality was this idea that even your sexual liaisons had to be purified. Menstruation. Nothing inherently wrong with that, but again, be clean. Eating unclean meat. So if accidentally you are eating some meat and someone says, "Oops, that wasn't kosher," as it were. Oops, I got to get clean then before I can come back in the camp. Touching a dead body by accident. If you touch a dead body, you're unclean. And you look at laws like this and say, wow, this is a little extreme here, God. Why all these laws about all these things about how you should be clean? Again, it's not so much about the outward, it's the way in which God constantly throughout the camp is saying to these people, you must be clean. You're living in a place that's God has deigned to be the place of his presence. He chose to reveal himself there. It's not as if the place was holy in and of itself. It's holy because God decided to reveal himself there. And so if you're going to be the people among whom God reveals himself, whom God has chosen to as his special place where he will reveal himself to the world, you have an obligation to be clean. And all these little signs, all these little reminders for people to stay clean outwardly was a reminder for them to stay clean inwardly. It's kind of like a bunch of refrigerator magnets, that they had to look at all the time, and reminders and beeps on their phone. Day in and day out, no matter what they did, if they got sick or they were having relationships or their physical bodily functions, or as they were picking up food, as they were walking by, as they were handling bodies, all these different things, it was a reminder to them, are you staying clean? Are you staying clean? Inwardly and outwardly. So this emphasis on cleanliness, to be among the people of God, to be in the holy presence of God, this is a theme that waves its way all the way through the law. And then, as we continue to move on, in addition to these general instruction to be clean, usually what we find is that this cleanliness, these exhortations or commands really to be clean, are paired together with sacrifices. So that when you are ready to come back into the camp and the priest has declared you clean, you not only have to bathe, you have to bring with you a sacrifice in many occasions. I took this text from Leviticus 14, and this has to do with that issue of skin disease. If the priest declares you clean and you come in with you want to come back in the camp, not only do you have to wash, but notice what it says here in addition. The law is on the 8th day, after they've been declared clean, so the week later, they must bring 2 male lambs, 1 ewe lamb and a year old, each without defect, along with 3/10 of an ephah of the finest flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, and 1 log of oil. And the priest who pronounces them clean shall present both the one to be cleansed and their offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. So your cleanliness has to be paired with a sacrifice. And you see that over and over again. And you say to yourself, why is this always the case? That in order to enter the tent of meeting, this place of God's presence, I'm clean. The priest has looked at me and said I'm clean. I've bathed, I've conformed to the law, and then and bring a sacrifice. And I think the impetus behind that is this realization that it doesn't matter how clean you are on the outward, you're not getting into the presence of God based upon your own cleanliness. Even after you've bathed, even after you've cleaned, there still has to be a sacrifice in order to enter the holy presence of God. Because no matter how clean we are, you're still not clean enough to enter the holy presence of God. See, you and I, we don't think about that much. Because we're just kind of, we come to church and we just think God is around everywhere. And, we pray flippantly to him. We sing flippantly to him. But imagine you lived in a place where this holiness of God was held at such a high esteem that you didn't go into it. If you wanted to live, you didn't just go stumbling into the holy presence of God. You just didn't do it. So this is a reminder that if you're going to go into the holy presence of God, outward cleansing, fine, but there's still a sacrifice needed. We're never clean enough by ourselves. Some inner cleansing, some sacrifice has to take place. There's a link between the two. And sometimes when we think about sacrifice, we wonder, what is it about the sacrifice? Why is it that the Old Testament Israel dealt so much with sacrifice? I was talking about it with somebody the other day, and they're animal lovers, and they said, yeah, I skip all that part about sacrifice. I can't deal with that. All those animals being sacrificed, I just can't deal with that. What's the point of that? Well, among other things, I think at the very root and cause of it, as this person came with their sacrifice to the priest, there should be a recognition that this clean animal is taking my place. This should be me being killed. I deserve death. And God, in His grace and mercy, is taking the death of this substitute for me. For what reason, I don't know, but He has taken the death of this beast that I offer in place for my own failure and my own sin. I mean, that's really what's behind these sin offerings and the guilt offerings that were brought before the Lord. They are a substitute for me. And that substitute needs to be pure and clean. Look what it says here. It says, here it says, the 2 male lambs, the 1 ewe lamb, a year old, without defect. And that reality weaves its way all the way through the Old Testament requirement for a sacrifice. It must be pure. See, that's the only way it's going to act as a substitute for you. You substitute something dirty, they might as well kill you. But this pure, clean thing takes the place for me. That's really the idea that's underneath it. And so you can see, as you start to build this picture, the strong emphasis of this need to be clean if you're going to enter in the presence of God. And no matter what we do to clean ourselves, there's still a sacrifice that's required if we're really going to get into the holy presence of God, notwithstanding all of our effort to be clean. So you can begin to see now where I'm going, why I think these arguments are, why this background is so important and how it influences what Jesus teaches us about baptism and what the New Testament teaches. Well, let's take this to the next level. There's this reference now to the water and how at the place of worship there's supposed to be this use of water for cleansing. So kind of a transfer of emphasis, not just on the bathing that you do, but on on the water that cleanses. And watch what we have here. This from Numbers, and then there's an also passage in Numbers 19. The one I quote here is from Numbers 8. It says, "Take the Levites from among all the Israelites and make them ceremonially clean. To purify them, do this, sprinkle the water of cleansing on them. Then have them shave their whole bodies and wash their clothes, and they will purify themselves." So here's a whole tribe of people that God selected, and He said, your job is to take care of the tabernacle, and later on the temple. Your job is just to make sure that when the people of God come and worship, everything is in place. Your job is to make sure all the furniture is in place, everything's clean, everything's done well, everything's taken care of. If you're going to serve in this holy place, then you have a special necessity to be clean. So before you start to serve God, and you're a servant of God, especially in His place of worship, you need to be clean. Don't think you can serve in the tabernacle and not be clean yourself. And so there's this emphasis, take this water of cleansing. There's water that needs to be applied, in this case sprinkled, over the people. This whole group, this one group of people, this Levi tribe, that didn't get any inheritance, they had no land, their inheritance was taking care of the tabernacle. One group of people that's just selected. That group has to be cleansed with this water of cleansing. And then we look then, and in the architecture itself, both in the tabernacle and the temple. Now, just in case some of you are not really up on the Israelite history, remember that the tabernacle was the tent that was built as they were wandering through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. So the tabernacle was a temporary dwelling, and wherever they moved, this tabernacle would get packed up like a big tent and just move from place to place. And the Levites had a very specific order in which they were supposed to wrap this up and carry it from place to place. So that was the job of the Levites. Well, within that tabernacle, there is this, what's called a basin or a laver, depending on your translation. And God has very specific instructions. He tells Moses exactly how to build this. He says, make a bronze basin with its bronze stand. Why? For washing. Place it between the tent of meeting and the altar and put water in it. Once you're in the presence of God, before you go to the altar, wash yourself. There's this basin of water right in the middle of the tabernacle. Just imagine, as you walk in there, before you get to the altar to sacrifice, there's this basin. The priest needs to wash himself before he tries to administer the sacrifice. If you bring your sacrifice, you have to be clean. That whole business about the sacrifice has to be a matter of cleanliness. And it's, on one hand, a physical necessity. I mean, if you could just imagine all these animals getting slaughtered, there's probably going to be a mess, just saying. And you probably need some water around to do the cleanup. But this is more even than a perfunctory, requirement. This is a ceremonial requirement. That there be this basin to remind them that if you're going to be engaged in the sacrifice, it's got to be a clean sacrifice. The people involved have to be clean. So that's at the tabernacle level. Well, what we see then is when the temple gets built, and the temple gets built much later under Solomon. When the temple gets built, God again gives very specific instructions about the permanent structure, the temple that's in Jerusalem. Instead of that one laver or basin that gets put in between the tent of meeting and the altar, now you have 10 of them. 10 bronze basins. And this is an artist's, both that last picture and this one is an artist's reconstruction. We don't have, obviously, none of them remain, so it's just based upon what the scriptural text says. People have tried to imagine what they could have looked like. We do have some specifics here. You can see he then made 10 bronze basins, each holding 40 baths and measuring 4 cubits across, one basin to go to each of the 10 stands. So there's this 10 basins that go on. And I give you a little translation there that 40, they each hold about 240 gallons. And they're about 5 feet circumference there, or diameter, I mean. So it gives you an idea. These 10 of these placed all the way around the temple. Again, what's the message? If you're going to come in the temple, you better wash. And here are all these basins to clean yourself, to make sure that you're ready to enter. So that's on the temple side. Then switch over, and just in case you miss one of those 10, here's this huge thing right in the middle called the Bronze Sea. It has different names, but there's this huge structure. Again, obviously an artist's reconception, a conception of it. We don't have this thing left. In fact, we find out very clearly that this is one of the things that when the Babylonians came and destroyed Jerusalem and took over the temple, we're told very clearly they broke this thing apart and took it back with them to Babylon. So this Bronze Sea was destroyed, we know, during the Babylonian invasion. But for as long as it existed, it says he made the sea of cast metal. So the word sea, I think, is just meant to say, and scholars debate this, but I think the issue is there's just a lot of water in this sucker. It's just this big thing, and it represents this water, this huge mass of water. He made this sea of cast metal, circular in shape, meaning 10 cubits from rim to rim, 5 cubits high. They took a line of 30 cubits to measure around it. And again, I give you in the notes there what that means. 15 feet in diameter, 7.5 feet deep, circumference of around 40 feet, 12,000 gallons. And you can see underneath of it was this 12 bulls, assuming to mention the 12 tribes of Israel, holding it up, this need for the whole people of God to be cleansed. And we think there might be spigots kind of around the bottom of this thing so that people, as the water got filled, they could use that as well to wash and clean. So there, as you walk into this temple courtyard, there's this huge vat of water. The message being incredibly clear to the people of God: if you're coming in here, you better be clean. So you look back at all this, the Levitical law, the architecture of the tabernacle, the architecture of the temple. And do you think God has made a rather clear about how he feels about cleanliness if you're going to come into the presence of God? I sometimes wonder if we've lost some of that when we come into the presence of God. Now, I realize that it's possible to overdo this. But sometimes in a worship experience, sometimes the familiar kind of, the way we get folksy and familiar sometimes makes us forget what's really happening. We're here. We're coming into the holy presence of God. What are our symbols that remind us, if you're going to come into the presence of God, cleanliness is important? I don't know what that would be. I don't know where those images and symbols are. But in the Old Testament Israel, we'll see how this spells itself out in the New Testament. But I think without that, now some of the more liturgical traditions have more water around. They do more with water. It's a symbolic reminder. But I think sometimes when we kind of evangelicals, Protestants come together to worship, somehow, what's the reminder of the holiness of God when we do this? If it's too familiar and too folksy, we miss something. This reminder that if you're going to enter the presence of God, cleanliness is required and sacrifice is required. Keep that in mind now as we move forward, because now we're going to switch from the law and the tabernacle and the temple to the prophets. And the prophets, I think, are going to add another whole layer to this teaching about the necessity of cleanliness and what is envisioned for the future. So as we turn now, let's look at the prophet Elisha. And this story comes up, and you remember there is this man Naaman who's a commander of a foreign king, the king of Aram. And this is one of his commanders, and so he comes and he has this skin disease, and he comes and he reports to Elisha, who is known then as the prophet and the man of God. So we have this text that says, "So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to say, 'Go wash yourself 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed.'" Go wash yourself in the Jordan. We see that again in the New Testament, don't we? Go wash yourself in the Jordan 7 times. And the general consensus is it means completion, perfection. Go wash yourself in the Jordan. So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored and became clean like that of a young boy. There's a promise here. It's a prophetic promise. He goes into this river and he dips 7 times, and there's another word there, Hebrew word, just to show you it's another word used from which we can begin to build our notion of baptism. But here's this foreign king, not even a Jewish person. All right, he's from outside the circle of Judaism. Even he comes to a prophet, to the man of God, and he says, "I have this skin disease." And the prophet says, "Go dip in the water 7 times and the skin disease will be gone." And his skin was clean, like a young boy's skin. Quite a miracle. But I think in the midst of that is this promise coming, that there's a cleansing coming, there's a healing coming. There's something coming that's going to clean up this situation. And that promise is connected somehow to this washing and this water and this cleansing. But there's a Spirit of God coming that intends to clean. And not just the people of Israel, not just the priests, it's the people outside the circle. It's this commander from the king of Aram. Nations will come, be baptized, and be clean. And it's not that there's anything sacred about the Jordan River per se. I mean, have any of you been to Israel and seen the Jordan River? I've seen pictures. I haven't been there. I told you it's still on my bucket list. But it's nothing to look at, really, is it? I mean, it's kind of a little muddyish, a little this. So there's nothing magical about the water. No, what's here is the promise that somehow God is going to bathe these people, that He's going to wash them as they dip in this water. So we're starting to see this prophetic element that somehow God is promising something in the future, something that's in the order of cleansing that we haven't really seen before or known before. So you can imagine the people of the day saying, yes, we know we're supposed to be clean. We know all the laws, but here's this commander from another place. He doesn't even follow the law. Elisha says, go dip 7 times in the Jordan and that's it? He's clean? What's going on here? The power of God is miraculous here. Something powerful is being spoken through the prophet. And that theme continues. Look at this text from Isaiah and Jeremiah, and I just picked a couple. They're all the way through the prophets. I could have spent all day just walking through the prophetic elements. But here we begin to have this really hard-coded link between the outer and the inner. The idea that the outer symbol is meant to say something about the inner purity. The symbolism that was always present in Levitical law about the need to stay clean, now in the prophets becomes altogether explicit. There's a direct link between the necessity to be clean outwardly and be clean inwardly. And we see that theme repeated over and over again. So look at Isaiah chapter 1, right at the beginning. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. So here's this clear link. In fact, let me just turn there for a moment because there's a longer passage there. I should have put that in here for you. Earlier in that chapter, or a couple verses before then. Let me just go there quickly and read it to you. You can put this in your notes. This is the passage in the first, and I'd encourage you to go back and read that first chapter of Isaiah. He says, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Listen to the instructions of our God, you people of Gomorrah. He's talking to Israel here, and he's calling them Sodom and Gomorrah. That's what he thinks about their activity. They're now Sodom and Gomorrah, even though they're his children. You've never called your children names like this, have you? When they misbehave? And God is saying, this is Sodom and Gomorrah. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough of burnt offerings, of rams, and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. When you come to me to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations. I cannot bear your worthless assemblies, your new moon, your feasts, and your appointed festivals. I hate with all my being. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer many prayers, I am not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Then he says, wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. You see what he's doing here? He says, you guys have been banking on this ceremonial cleanness. No way. That stuff is burden to me. It doesn't mean anything to me if it's not joined to that inner cleanliness. So stop. Stop thinking that the ceremony in and of itself is what cleans you. No, something has to happen inside. There has to be a cleanliness of soul and spirit. I'm so glad we're past the day that we think that we can just come and worship and be okay just because of that, right? I'm so glad we think that we can just come here and as long as we go to church, we're good. You know? Remember Godfather? They all went to church, and then they went out and killed everybody. So I'm like, well, how does this two go together? We don't do that in the evangelical world, do we? See, God is saying, look, don't come into my presence with all your religious stuff and think because you're going through the outward motions, you're taking care of the problem. He's saying there's this link between the outward ceremony and the inward reality that I'm not seeing. There has to be an inward cleanliness. Wash away that filth and that wickedness inside of you, not just the outside of your skin. The prophets continue. This is especially powerful a prophecy, and I wish I could spend a whole class just going over this section, because this prophet Ezekiel is powerful in this regard, talking about this new thing that's coming. And part of that newness, look what he says early on, Ezekiel, and then later. I picked out two passages of many that refer to this theme. The first comes from Ezekiel 16. He says, I bathed you with water and washed the blood from you and put ointments on you. I clothed you with an embroidered dress and put sandals of fine leather on you. I dressed you in fine linen and covered you with costly garments. He's saying, you're my children. I took care of you. I cleaned you. I washed you. I made you whole and pure. I put all these fine garments on you. And then he goes on and he tells them, but look what you've done. You've spoiled yourself. In this passage, he compares Israel to, in his prophecy, he compares Israel to a prostitute. He's taken awesome care of her, made her beautiful. She's gone and ran off and prostituted herself to other nations. That's the image that he gives of Israel. So in the midst of that imperfection, that original cleansing, now he promises, though, that when they return and when they repent, when they come back to him, look what he says. There's this promise in Ezekiel 36. It says, I will sprinkle clean water of you, and you will be clean. I will cleanse you from all your impurities and from all your idols. I will give you a new heart and put a new spirit within you. I will remove from you your heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. In this text, he's going beyond saying what he said in Isaiah and saying clean up. He's saying, I'm going to clean you up. Just like I cleaned you up in the first place, I'm going to clean you up. I am going to come on you, and I am going to make you clean. I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to cleanse you from all. I'm going to clean up your soul. So he's actually promising here that he will do the work. Because remember what we learned all the way back in Leviticus, no matter how clean we tried to make ourselves, we always had to bring a sacrifice. Now God is saying, look, there's a day coming, there's a time coming where I'm going to do the cleaning. I'm going to change you. I'm going to make you into a new person. I'm going to give you that new heart. I'm going to be the one who doesn't just clean you outwardly. I'm going to clean you inwardly. That's the promise that he makes. So this baptism or this dipping or this washing and this cleansing was no longer just going to affect the outward. It affects the inward. He's going to change us from the inside out. And some of us can testify to that. If I had to go around, and maybe in your group you can have time to share, this idea that somehow when God invades our life, stuff begins to change. Our desires change. Our passions change. Our anger is not quite at what it used to be. Our jealousy isn't what it used to be. Some things began to change. Sometimes we need a little more changing to come, but it begins to happen. That's the Spirit of God working on us. Part of our salvation, part of what God promises here, is that he's going to do the changing. It's him doing the baptizing. So what we've seen up to this point is a person baptizing themselves, right? Like they wash in the water, they dip, they cleanse themselves. Even Naaman had to go dip into the water. So up until this point, we've had this command, go do it. But here in this promise, it's God is going to wash you. You are going to be cleansed by something, someone else. You're not the agent who washes yourself anymore, because we've discovered that doesn't really create a new heart. No, if we're going to create a new heart and cleanse, it has to be something from the outside, somebody from the outside, some power from the outside that can get inside and clean us up internally. Because otherwise, we're just going through the motions of religion. It's not really cleansing us in any real sense. And so that's the promise that Ezekiel holds out, that he will, that God will do the internal cleansing. And then, of course, I picked some passages up from Zechariah. And this particular prophet, he's talking to the people of God about when they're rebuilding their temple, and they've kind of gotten lax. Again, just to remind everybody, the first temple gets built by Solomon, and that temple stands for several centuries until God, in his anger, must judge the people, and so he sends the Babylonians to destroy that temple. So the temple gets destroyed by the Babylonians, and they get taken into captivity for 70 years. But then God, in his mercy, repents, and he allows the people to come back and rebuild the temple again. And so it's during this period that the prophet Zechariah is working. He's encouraging the people, it's time to rebuild this temple. Come on, let's get going. And he's trying to encourage them in this rebuilding, and he's saying to them, one of the words of promise come from Zechariah 13. He says clearly, on that day, that is the day of the Lord, when he visits them, on that day a fountain will be opened to the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to cleanse them from sin and impurity. See, there's going to come a day where we're not just talking about a basin and a laver in the middle. We're not even talking about the big molten sea. We're talking about an open fountain that cleanses not just the temple area, but all the house of David, all the inhabitants. That there's going to be a fountain open up and cleanse the people. Spiritual prediction. There's going to be somebody coming that's going to come and clear and clean the house. There's going to be somebody coming that's going to just bring this flow of cleanliness to the people here. Look ahead. Think ahead. While they're rebuilding the structure of the temple, think that going forward, God's going to bring something. Forget the molten sea. There's going to be a fountain that cleanses the whole town and all the people. That's the promise of the prophet. So you can see that from this very brief, too brief outline of the Old Testament teaching, from the very beginnings, there's this promise that God is going to clean, that there's this necessity for cleanliness, that God is going to do that for the people. And keep that in mind then as we turn to the New Testament. We're going to do this next week, but there's two more things I want to point out. There are two pretty interesting references in the New Testament, and there's two other instances from Old Testament images that they use. The first comes from 1 Peter chapter 3, and I just want to take us there because this is a bit of a problematic passage, and I thought I'd just comment on it briefly. Since we're talking about Old Testament images of baptism, there are two places in the New Testament where they take an Old Testament image like this and talk about baptism explicitly. And one is this 1 Peter chapter 3. And it's a difficult passage, and I won't be able to solve all the problems. But Peter is making the argument in this passage that we ought not to be discouraged by suffering. Because suffering happens. It happened to Christ. And suffering does not define us. And you don't need to think of suffering as God's judgment on you. That's not what's happening. It's what happens to righteous people in a dark age. When there's sin in the world, suffering's going to happen. And he's trying to encourage the people, don't feel that this is a sign of God's disapproval, because Christ himself had to suffer. And in that context, he makes this argument, starting in verse 18. He says, "For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. So it's this, again, getting back to this uniqueness of the death of Christ. We suffer like he suffered. He suffered like we suffer. But his death was different in that he was this unrighteous. Remember, we talked about how the sacrifice had to be pure and complete in order for it to be effective. Otherwise, just another sinning thing was dying. It's supposed to be a symbol of cleanliness that dies in our place. He's saying that was Christ. He was the one who died in our place. He was righteous. And he does that to bring us to God so that we can come into the holy presence of God. He's taking care of that sin problem for us. And that is, so he even suffered death, but he was made alive again in the Spirit, talking about his resurrection. And being made alive, he went, and this is the confusing part, verse 19. He says, after being made alive, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits. That's an interesting phrase. He made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, to those who were disobedient a long time ago. And here it comes, that Old Testament message. A long time ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. So he's saying Jesus, in the midst of his sacrifice, after his death and resurrection, he makes a proclamation. And it's to those beings, whatever they are, that have been somehow, it says, imprisoned since the days of Noah. Complicated passage. We don't know what that means exactly. In fact, the great Martin Luther, who I think is one of the best theologians of all time, said, yeah, I don't know what this means. So if he didn't know what it means, here am I trying to explain it to you. Augustine had an interesting take on this. He and a lot of folks after him thought that this is talking about how Noah himself proclaimed that Christ, through Noah, proclaimed the message of hope. So he's talking about Noah's testimony to the people around him as he was building the ark. But I think really what this is talking about is that if you read that story around the story of Noah, there's this sin of humankind that somehow is propagated by fallen angels. I mean, that's really what's going on there, that somehow there's this rampant rebellion among fallen angels who create this sin. They call them the sons of God united with the sons of men. And it's this group of fallen angels that kind of continue to spread evil. I think that's really what's underneath here. There's these spirits that cause this rampant spread of evil around the days of Noah. And if you remember, it's that judgment of God to then destroy the earth. It's the only time he ever destroyed the earth, save that one man, Noah. And so I think what this text is trying to say, or if I had to guess, I think there's some sense in which Jesus on his resurrection, he goes back and proclaims to those spirits that tried to lead the world astray, hey, you lost. The battle is over. The victory is won. You couldn't destroy the world, I just saved it. You know, that kind of message. There's a declaration of victory. I think that's what's behind the text here. And I'm not alone in that. There are other scholars who think that as well. I'm not inventing anything new here. But anyway, what I want you to see is how it's now talking about Noah in the ark. As it continues in verse 20, it says, God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built. In it, only a few people, 8 in all, were saved through water. And this water symbolizes baptism that now saves you. Not just the removal of dirt from the body, but the pledge of a clear conscience towards God. It saves you by the resurrection of Jesus, who has gone into heaven and is at God's right hand with angels, authorities, and powers in submission to him. That's one of the reasons why I think this is talking about powers, evil powers that were around. Now they're in submission to him. But notice how the writer, Peter, is linking up this deliverance that happened with Noah, that he was preserved from this judgment of God through the water. And he's making this link and saying, in the same way, God through water saves you. This water baptism is a symbol of the salvation of God. It's a symbol of the resurrection of Christ. I mean, this is a hard link between baptism, that idea of dipping down and coming up. That's a symbol of the resurrection of Jesus. So as Moses was saved through the waters from the judgment that was coming, he's saying that symbol of baptism, that's your symbol of God saving you, just as he saved Noah from judgment. And that's through Christ himself, who died and rose again. Just as Christ suffered, rose again, you will follow him in suit. Your suffering is not the end of the story. You follow Christ in his victory. Right now it seems like the enemy is winning, the demons are winning. But Christ already declared victory over those. And your baptism is a symbol, just as it was a symbol in Noah's day of salvation. Your baptism is a symbol of salvation. That you participate in the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think that's really at the core of this meeting. So see how Peter himself sees this Old Testament image of baptism. And I point that out because sometimes, I don't want you to think that I'm over here manufacturing all this idea about baptism comes from the Old Testament. Peter himself is doing this. He's going to the Old Testament and seeing how baptism is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. And then let me refer to one other passage. It comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where baptism is explicitly mentioned, this time by Paul. And this whole section, we're going to come back to this chapter and this chapter and the following chapter when we deal with the Lord's Supper. But in this text, he's talking about baptism. Look at chapter 10, beginning in verse 1 there. It says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea." Again, referring to that wandering through the deserts of Israel, where they passed through the Red Sea. Remember, God held back the waters as they crossed through the Red Sea, and the Egyptians came in and were drowned in the process. So they were passed through the sea. They passed through the water. They were saved through the passing through of that water. They escaped unscathed. And through the cloud. That's the idea of God's presence there, was with them the whole time. The cloud of God's presence. So they were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. And then you have this interesting statement in verse 2. They were all baptized into Moses. They were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. In other words, Moses then was the type of Christ. He was representing, leading them out of bondage into the Holy Land. So he was kind of a type of Christ there. And so the children of Israel, in a way, by passing through the sea and passing through the cloud, they were following their representative, their leader, out of bondage into the promised land. They went through that baptism, as you were, to get to the promised land. Paul is saying this is all a type of what Christ would do. Lead people out of bondage and captivity through the water to the promised land. And then that's what he says in verse 3. They all ate the same spiritual food, the manna, drank the same spiritual drink. They all drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them. Remember that story of that rock pouring, that water pulling out from the rock. What he's saying is, just as the children of Israel passed through the water and were rescued, so also now through Christ, he feeds. He gives you the water. He gives you the food. He sustains you. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were sacrificed in the wilderness. And then verse 6, "Now these things occurred as examples to us, to keep us from setting our hearts on the evil things they did. Do not become idolaters, as some of them were. It is written, they ate and drank and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. In one day, 23,000 of them died. We should not test Christ, as some of them did, were killed by snakes. And do not grumble, some of them did, and they were killed by a destroying angel. These things happened as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the ages has come." So this whole process of Israel going through the wilderness, going through the deliverance of the sea, after they had gone through all, they did all these sinful things. They never learned the lesson to be faithful. He's saying, listen, you've gone through the waters of baptism. Why are you going back to live as though you were still in captivity? Do you really have to learn those lessons all over again? The children of Israel, why did God take 2,000 years to write this story? Because he had nothing else to do? He wrote this story so you and I could learn from it, so that we could not repeat the mistakes of our ancestors. And so he's arguing with the Corinthian church. Look, they were baptized. They went through the waters of baptism. It's called the Red Sea. They were baptized in the crowd. They followed Moses through the wilderness. And yet, after all that, after all those miracles, they went over here and did all these horrible things. Even while God was giving them bread and giving them food, they still did all these horrible things. He said, did you not learn anything from them? What happened to them? They died. It didn't work out. So why, after you guys are baptized, do you go back and live in the way you were? Did you not learn anything about what God thinks? About how we ought to live our life after we're baptized? So that's really the argument that Paul is making there. And I point that out to say, again, let's take all this in. Next week we're going to look at the New Testament teaching when John comes on the scene and he baptizes. In fact, he baptizes Jesus. What's that all about? Why did Jesus have to be baptized? And then what did Jesus teach us about baptism? So we're going to look at baptism in the Gospels. But what we're going to see is that in many ways what happens in the New Testament, in the Gospels, is a direct fulfillment of all this Old Testament prophecy and this Old Testament teaching. And we see a little glimpse of that here by looking at these texts in Peter and Corinthians. But we'll see more of it next week.